Hey everyone, Coach Lee here, looking to bring you another video to help you become the best ultra runner that you can. Apologies that I've not been giving out any new videos over the last couple of weeks or so. Obviously with the manic craziness of Christmas and New Year's and all that stuff, and taking a bit of a break. Quickly then spilled over into getting prepped for our travels. So we head to Southeast Asia tomorrow. So that'll be Tuesday if you're watching this later on down the line. And we're obviously heading out traveling for 6 to 9 months. So we've obviously been getting everything ready for that. And just obviously with coaching and all that sort of jazz, everything just getting on top of me. I have not been able to produce a video. So what I thought I'd do today is quickly, or as quick as I can, as all of you that watch my videos will know, that's probably not going to be that quick. I will quickly summarize a little bit of a blueprint for prepping for an ultra race. Just thought I'd kick things off, try and hopefully promote some questions, discussions, and then hopefully that will feed into any other content of such things that you might want to see expansions on, but also then drive interest into some of the other videos I've already created. So you've got a race coming up. Where do you start? Well, first thing, create your long range plan. Quick overview of rough weekly distance, elevation targets, etc. from the final week of training before your taper phase, which remember should be 1 or 2 weeks before the race. That's going to be your sort of peak training volume and elevation, all that sort of stuff. And then work backwards from that final week all the way up until where you are today, whether that's 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, it doesn't matter. You can obviously work backwards in terms of modest increases in volume. And again, obviously this is going to be athlete dependent, so I'm not going to give specific numbers because unfortunately there are no specific numbers. We know some mileage minimums. So remember, just as a quick recap on that, for a 50k race, 30 miles per week for at least 3 weeks before your taper. For a 50-mile race or a 100k, 40 miles per week for at least 5 weeks before your taper. And then for a 100-mile race, 50 miles per week at least 6 weeks before your taper. So those are the minimums that at this point in time show that you maximize your chances of success by hitting those minimums. It doesn't mean that you're guaranteed, and it certainly doesn't mean that if you did a bit less than that you can't be successful. But those are, in my experience and what I've worked with my athletes, some good baseline mileages to go from. So if you're using those as that is those mileage minimums is the max that you can get in around your lifestyle and things like that, then obviously that is going to be your peak weeks. Work backwards from there. Obviously, not every single week has to increase in volume. You know, if you're thinking for a 50k race, 30 miles per week is the minimum, and that is pretty much what you can fit in, but you're already doing that day in, day out, then obviously you don't really need to worry too much about volume fluctuations. You can focus more on other attributes such as intensity, which I'll come on to in a second. But that's the first port of call. That starts to give you a little bit of an idea of the time commitment that you want to go through every single week, building up to those minimums. Obviously, if you can fit in more or you're already doing more, then by all means, obviously hit more. You know, we do know that volume is one of the best predictors of success. Mileage matters most. Quickly, followed by obviously being a fitter and more robust runner. Once you've mapped out that long range plan, like I said, that gives you a rough idea of your time commitments that you're going to then progress over the weeks, months, however long until that A race, or obviously if you've got multiple A races, you can do this obviously multiple times. Then we can use a few sort of principles to guide what we do in those blocks, those weeks. One of them is weaknesses furthest out from the race, so you've got more time to develop them, strengths closest to the race. Now, weaknesses can be leg turnover, it could be efficiency, it could be climbing ability, it could be descending ability. You probably will have highlighted some of these things that you may struggle with in other races. That's the whole point of reflecting and learning from those. So that's where you can then go, well, let's say my weakness is ability to climb hills. I want to improve my speed at which I can move uphill, because we know that on ultras, we spend most of our time climbing. So if we can become more efficient at that, that's obviously going to massively increase our speed over a particular course and obviously give us a better time overall. So yes, there's various ways we can address that, whether it is through shorter hill sprints to develop a bit more power, whether it's longer, sort of more endurance or threshold-based hill intervals to start improving that ability to buffer the fatiguing products from energy production, or even if it's just going out and doing runs on hilly terrain more frequently, so that one, we become more efficient, but also we can utilize some pickups where we maybe attack the hills a little bit quicker than normal and then use the flats and the downs as recovery periods. Obviously lots of different examples, but the principle remains the same, looking at those weaknesses furthest out from race day and strengths closest to race day. Equally, and what might be at odds a little bit, is we also want to develop the least specific attributes to our race furthest out from race day and the most specific attributes closest to race day. So that might be at odds to a degree, in the sense that if you are a weak climber, we obviously want to make sure we're addressing that furthest out from race day, but we're also saying that the stuff more specific to the event, doing it closest to race day, i.e. climbing a hill if you're doing a hilly ultra. Now that's where it might be for that particular attribute, you do it all year. You focus on really making it into a strength and then honing it even further as you get into your specificity phases of prep for your particular race. But both of those principles do work quite well together. Then once you've got an idea of, well, I want to develop these attributes furthest out, these attributes closest, then you can start to then arrange your training into blocks. And remember, I've talked about this in one of my other videos, but just breaking it down into somewhere between 4 to 8 week blocks. Obviously the tougher attributes to train and the ones that probably need more exposure and longer exposure are the lower intensity stuff, so things like aerobic capacity, etc. From your easy to moderate efforts, they need longer to be realised, so therefore you want probably bigger blocks. Whereas the higher intensity stuff, especially if we're doing things like VO2 max intervals, they need less time to see those adaptations, so you might only have a 3 or 4 week block for those. But you can then start to now block out your training on that long range plan, where you have a specific goal for each block. Getting better at hills, utilising some sessions to bias that, getting better at buffering lactate, i.e. a lactate threshold development block with some tempo work, an endurance block with specificity, looking at certain elevation targets to make sure you've covered a decent amount of elevation in prep for your race. If it's got, especially if it's got 3,000 meters or above, you obviously want to make sure you're getting a decent amount of that in over the week and obviously in some individual long runs. There, you've now started to put a bit of meat on the bones of your program. And we also know we want to get as fit as possible. So that's where we can utilize things like VO2 max development, lactate threshold development. Whilst we're not going to be running at those speeds in the race, they satisfy those least specific traits furthest out from race day as we then progress into more endurance-based training. So you're now putting all these blocks together. You've got rough ideas of volumes. Then you're going to populate the individual runs. And again, if someone wants a bit more of a detailed session on that, again, I've put a training runs video on YouTube already. So again, I won't spend too much time on that, but then you can start populating those runs. Remember, because we're utilizing a block training principle, we obviously want to bias a certain attribute at a certain time, so therefore you might see 2 or 3 of that particular session rather than just one, like we tend to see on typical running programs, especially road-based, where you do like 1 speed session a week, 1 tempo a week, or alternating those. You might do a lactate threshold development block where you're doing 2, maybe even 3 tempo sessions each week, and then fill in the rest of the gaps of your allocated volume with just easy to moderate runs. And there's your program. Obviously that's the easy part. The hardest part is getting out and doing it. But at least you're maximizing the potentials for success by taking a bit of time to do that element of planning. Then from there, as part of your blueprint, you need to practice nutrition. You need to develop a nutritional strategy in training and obviously for race day. And again, I've made another video on breaking down all the numbers as a guide for both training and racing. But remember the key principles: you need to practice, you need to develop your gut's ability to process and assimilate that food and that energy. And the best way to do that is to expose your body to that on regular occasions. So utilize your long runs as opportunities to practice and try and push the limits of what your stomach can handle and produce energy. Remember those minimums of, you're probably looking at 30 to 40 grams of carb per hour as a minimum. Something like 200 calories per hour as a minimum. We know that the gold standard at the moment in ultra racing is 90 grams of carbs per hour plus. and you're looking at more like 300 to 350 calories per hour as kind of what a lot of the runners tend to do at the top end. But you need to practice and build your stomach up to being able to handle more and more over time. So the longer you have, the more opportunities you have to practice that. But the key is you've got to plan ahead. You've got to organise yourself, figure out what you're going to try and to achieve those nutritional numbers from in training and obviously on your long runs and stuff like that, so that come race day, you literally have a plan of what you're going to eat and when, what sort of quantities, potentially what time intervals. That's not necessarily as important as at least knowing that you're eating a certain amount of carbs and calories per hour. How you do that over the hour isn't as important, but obviously everyone is a bit individual in terms of how they prefer to do that. Little and often is always the best overarching principle when it comes to that side of things. So that's your nutrition. That's obviously, again, a massive part of that ultra running blueprint. Then we've got the specificity element, i.e. making sure you're practicing or trying to replicate as much of your race as possible. That can be through things like tune-up races, but equally it doesn't have to be. It can just be in normal long runs. You could do a back-to-back weekend or something like that, where you're getting out in the hills, trying to get some decent elevation gain, some elevation loss, running with the kit that you have as a mandatory kit, running with the food that you think you're going to carry, obviously practicing your fueling like we talked about, and just getting used to any sorts of bits and pieces that you've not used, whether it's utilising trekking poles, etc. for the big climbs, if it's trying to develop your ability to descend a little bit more efficiently, utilising that as a skill practice session as well. That obviously comes in the back end of your programme, as I touched on already, but it's still an important element of training so that you're as prepared as possible. So even if you can't get on the specific route you're racing on, how can you best replicate that scenario without obviously accessing the route itself? Now, if you live somewhere that's completely flat and you don't have access to anything that even vaguely resembles a hill, but you're doing a hilly race, then make the treadmill your friend. Make fitness your friend, i.e. spend more time then, instead of doing sort of a longer endurance or specificity block, maybe do a longer lactate threshold block. If you're fitter, you'll still be able to then at least compensate a little bit of that lack of hill training with just being a fitter, more robust individual. Then final piece of the puzzle in terms of your program is strength work. Strength training and mobility are obviously key, and especially as we get older, joints, muscles degrade over time, unfortunately, and we can reduce that and slow down that process with resistance training of some form. It doesn't have to be squats, deadlifts and bench press. It doesn't have to be a specific type of strength training, as long as you're trying to overcome some form of resistance and ideally progressing that over time, then you're onto the right track. And again, remember, I've done a video on that. 2 days a week is absolutely optimal for most runners. Depending on the phase of training you're in, though, obviously you could fit in more. I'm doing 4 sessions at the moment, whilst doing a moderate amount of running mileage as well. But obviously that's what I can handle at this point in time. Other people can handle more, other people can handle less. And as I said, it depends on where you're in the program in terms of how much strength training you can fit in. But the key is it should be done in some format. And again, I've got loads of demo exercises on my YouTube as well. Dig into those. I've even got some sessions already, like a 20-minute follow along strength session. Feel free to dig into those in the video section as well. That's your blueprint. You've got your strength mobility work to make sure you're as efficient as possible. You're trying to minimize the chance of injuries. You've got your blocks planned out, you've got your goals planned out, you've got your volume planned out with just nice incremental increases over time, so you're not risking doing too much too soon. You've got a bit of thought around nutrition, what you're going to eat on race day. You've got a bit of thought about how you're going to replicate the demands of the race as much as possible. You then just got to go out and get the work done. And remember, consistency is the name of the game. No one is ever going to adhere to their program 100% on the whole. I've got lots of athletes that I work with, and including myself. 100% is not what I'm expecting. If we can, great, absolutely. But life is always going to get in the way. If you're got a full-time job, you've got kids, this, that, and the other. You're a recreational runner. You're not a pro athlete. There's always going to be things that throw curveballs. And yes, some people will say, well, you just got to deal with that and crack on. But again, for me, if you're hitting 80 to 90% of your sessions week in, week out, you're going to get some progress. You're going to get some fitness gains, and you're certainly going to be prepared for your upcoming event. So I think there's a balance to be struck there between just constantly stressing out about making sure you hit every run and having an element of acceptance that there's sometimes things will get in the way, and the best thing to do is understand how it got in the way, can it be avoided in the future, and cracking on with the rest of the program rather than thinking, well, now I've got to squeeze all these extra sessions in. And that kind of leads into me of not being afraid to take rest days. Again, this will go against what most of the sort of influencers on Instagram are doing, that are doing run streaks for weeks and years and all that sort of stuff, and never taking a day off and all that sort of thing. Fine, if that that works for them, works for them. I've never trained more than 5 days in a week personally, and I've seemed to have done all right in quite a few events and stuff like that. And certainly when I was more competitive in my younger years, I had no dramas of done training 5 days a week. I'm not a pro athlete. If I was, then of course I'd push the training boundaries a little bit more, but I can still progress quite linearly year on year if I just focus on consistency and 5 days of training a week, and obviously block training and all that sort of stuff. I find that can progress me quite easily and comfortably year on year without having to train 6 or 7 days a week. And there's not much more to it than that. I don't want to overcomplicate the process. That's you've got a program there. You know what types of training sessions. If you dig into a couple of my other videos, kind of a bit of an idea of how to construct strength sessions by looking at one of my other videos. It gives you the overarching idea of what you need to be doing to get ready. And then it's just going and doing the job. It's making sure that you arrive on the start line as fit as possible, but also as healthy as possible. Taking taper periods seriously, making sure you utilise those to again promote a bit of recovery. Not doing too many races back to back so that you've got time in between events to recover and minimise again niggles and injuries creeping in, and really prioritising the races that are actually something meaningful to you rather than just doing everything on there because you've got to race all the time. Again, I'm of the camp that if it's an A race, you should only be looking at maybe 2 or 3 of those a year, because the A races you want to be trying to get there as in tip-top shape as possible. And if you're racing all the time, that's going to make it harder for you to get any decent traction with a decent training block, because then you're going to have to start looking at, again, not necessarily taper if it's a B or C race, but still maybe a little bit of a reduction in volume, a little bit of a recovery period after potentially, and then again a bit of a build up before you get back to your base level mileage. Whereas if you don't do those races, you then can just train straight through and actually tip up to your A races in optimal condition, which is what I would encourage most runners to do. Anyway, that's, I think, 17 minutes. I've blabbed on enough there. Any questions on that, as always, chuck them in the comments below. If this has kind of prompted any questions from you that you then want to see in a video made, please just chuck it in the comments below. I think I've hit everything so far. The only thing I've not done that people have asked for is a kind of showing you visually what a certain amount of carbs, etc. looks like, just because we've been moving around all the place and not got our own home anymore at the moment. It's just obviously been a bit more challenging to buy things that I'm probably not then going to use myself and kind of waste. So I will do that at one point once we get a bit more settled with that side of things. But if there's anything that anyone wants me to specifically cover, please say, and I'll make another video of it. Hope you all had a good Christmas, good New Year's, all that jazz, and you're getting into a routine with training. If I can help in any way, shape or form, like I said, chuck a question in the comments. My email is lee@ultramarathonccoach.co.uk. Send me an email. There's no sales involved here. I'll happily respond to any questions that you've got. If you do want something a bit more formal, there's obviously my free coaching emails in the links below in the description, and my online running club where I'll write a bespoke program for you and kind of get you involved in a little bit of a running community that I'm building at the moment. That's in the group in the description as well. If you have friends and stuff, share the video, subscribe to the channel, and I'll be back into a routine of putting out a video every week now. Like I said, I fly tomorrow to Hong Kong, so I'll have hopefully a little bit more interesting content. I'll be filming as we're going around running. We're going to use all trails to the max to make sure we get some decent running routes and stuff like that. So I'll have a bit more interesting background scenery as well in between just me blabbing on about the important stuff. And I'll catch you up when we're abroad.